right, we'll recommence the meeting, and perhaps staff assisting us on the representation review could come to the table. I'm not going to deal with the Sister City one until after this. Right. So, I just kind of wanted to make a couple of comments first. One is that there's been obviously considerable public interest in this subject since the matter was first put on the agenda. And of course, you know, items do go on the agenda before the council has an opportunity to debate them. So there's obviously a lot of commentary that precedes a discussion such as the one that we're going to have today. Something that seems to be absent from the discussion so far is an understanding that this is a legal process that we're required to go through under the Local Government Act. I would perhaps draw people's attention to Clause 19H of the Local Electoral Act 2001, which says that a territorial authority must determine by resolution and in accordance with this part whether the members of the territorial authority are proposed to be elected by the electors of the district as a whole, so that's your at-large election, by the electors of 2 or more wards, or in some cases by the electors of the district as a whole, in other cases by the electors of each ward of the district. And then it talks about where you've determined to have when you're determined to have wards, the proposed name and proposed boundaries of each ward, and the number of members proposed to be elected by the electors of each ward, the proposed number of elected members of any, we're not covered by the local board section, whether the elected members of any local board are proposed to be elected by the electors of the local board area as a whole. No, I don't even need to go through that. The most important one is this: the determination required, it is required by law, by subsection 1 must be made by a territorial authority at least once in every period of 6 years after the year in which the first determination was made. So you can do it every 3 years, but you must do it every 6 years. So you can't go more than 6 years without doing a representation review. We decided to do undertake a slightly different approach with this representation review, and that was to go out and engage with communities in quite a different way. So rather than start from the top down, we started from the bottom up. And well, actually, I don't like the word bottom, grassroots. We started from the grassroots up, and we engaged with a number of people that really hadn't engaged with the council before, and in a way were quite deliberate in the way that we were able to engage people in a conversation about this. I have to say that one of the issues that is challenging for us as a city is that when Banks Peninsula and Christchurch City, I believe, were technically dissolved and then re-emerged as a single council, it created an issue for us with Akaroa Wairewa. And the last time we were in front of the Local Government Commission, they were pretty clear that we can't continue to have separate community boards and separate wards, and a separate ward in the way that we have done that. But they certainly accepted that there was an issue around Akaroa Wairewa from a community board perspective, but they said no more can you have this huge disparity in the numbers of population. And this is an issue for any part of New Zealand that has large tracts of land but very few people populating those large tracts of land. So we have to bring this entire sweeping ward into our city. We leave the community board in all of the proposals that we're going to be discussing today. We leave the community board there in Akaroa Wairewa, but it does create an issue. And in fact, many of the discussions that we're having around the type of wards that we'll be discussing inside the city boundary are all predicated on this huge decision about having to bring this large ward geographically, but population-wise, a very small ward, into the rest of the city arrangements. And a lot of the juggling has actually occurred around that one single decision. And the irony of it all is that if you want to get to that part of our boundary as a city, and we decide to go through Hallswell, we literally have to enter Selwyn District Council in order to get there. The only way that we can get to Akaroa, if we want to stay within our own boundaries and not use any of Selwyn's roads, we would have to go through the Littleton Tunnel or over the Gebbies Pass. So that creates a number of issues, but it does mean that we as a city council are dealing with district council issues on a day-by-day basis. It does impact on the discussion that we're having here. So I think that there was a view that certainly I'd seen expressed in some quarters that we were doing this because we just wanted to. We're doing this because we have to. And actually what I always wanted was that this would be a mechanism for engaging communities in a serious conversation about how do you formulate boundaries that then become decision-making frameworks? Because the more decision-making that we can delegate to those areas, you can see why community of interest is so relevant and so important to the discussion. So I wanted to just put that on the record, a legal requirement to review. It's called a representation review. It's reviewing our representation arrangements. We are legally, it would be unlawful for us not to do it in this term. So I'd like to hand over to Yanni, who chaired the working group that brought together a range of elected members, both from the council and from community board, in order to bring forward these options for our consideration today. Thank you, Yanni.
Thank you. Just really wanted to start off by acknowledging the huge amount of work that staff have done in this regard. At the start, you talked about taking a grassroots up approach to this engagement, and that's exactly what's happened. This has been a huge process when council's been in the middle of its long-term plan and its district plan review to go out and connect with local people in local communities to understand how they feel about their representation requirements. And I think it's really important to note that this actually isn't about what we think as individual councillors. This is about what our community is telling us in terms of how they wish to be represented. That, to me, is actually the test of this process and the test of the resolutions that we pass. Not what we individually, philosophically or ideologically think, not what we think will benefit us individually the most at a personal level, but actually how do we get a system of local democracy in our city that is fair and effective and that recognises distinct communities of interest. So it was overwhelming, in my view. The feedback from people was that they wanted relatively small geographical areas and significantly smaller ward areas than the current than what we currently have. There was feedback that talked about people being more likely to vote when they knew who their candidates were, who were standing in their wards, having a lower ratio of population to councillors, and really also the fact that smaller wards enabled closer connection between councillors and communities, thus enabling better representation. At this point, I think it's interesting to note that the metro average for New Zealand for a councillor per population ratio is 1 to 16,500. And when you look at the options that we've brought forward, it's interesting to go through the 14, the 16 and the 19, because as we went through our engagement, what we heard from our community, again, the majority of participants, was that they would like to have a ratio somewhere from between 1 to 15,000 to 1 to 20,000. And so when you look at the options that we've actually developed, you start at the 14, which is 1 to 21,000 to 1 to 26,000. So there's a range between them, plus or minus 10%. Each ward has its own unique situation, but that is effectively what the 14 does. So that doesn't really meet the feedback that we've had. The 16 has a kind of a more firmer imprint in terms of what people have asked for, 1 to 19,000 to 1 to 20,000. So it's probably got, again, a good reflection of what people have said, as does the 19 option, which is 1 to 16,000 to 1 to 19,000. So you can see that the 16 and the 19 options are really the ones that reflect what the community have said. The thing that, the other points that people made was that their lives have contracted into their local areas post-earthquake. There's been a resurgence in local activities, local things happening as a result of the impacts of the earthquake. Now we know that those won't last forever, but certainly over the next 6 years, as this representation reformulates its wards, those I think are critical considerations that we should take into account. So there's been a huge amount of work gone into this process. This is, as the Mayor said, this is the initial proposal, and this is the chance for people to have their say. So we're not making a firm decision today. We're trying to go out with a proposal that balances what we've heard from local communities, and I think, option 2, the 16 ward model with single member wards does that. I think you get wards that do balance the need for local representation and keep communities of interest together as best as possible. Now, I think it's a good starting position, and if we've got it wrong, we'll hear from people. We'll hear from the public and communities if they want more councillors or less councillors. But that is actually a good middle ground approach, I think, to recognising what people have said. The thing is that I just want to emphasise, because I know that there's an amendment going to be put up shortly, and in some ways that's disappointing because I respect the right for councillors to make amendments. I just want you to understand that we have gone through a huge amount of work to understand the different aspects of what makes up local wards. And there's a number of things in here that are set out in terms of the Local Electoral Act, in terms of consideration and guidelines. And that is looking at things like voter turnout. It is looking at things like socio-economic areas. It is looking at where geographical boundaries go around communities. So these things cannot easily just be put to one side at a whim. They actually take a lot of time to understand and try and calculate. And that has been a huge focus of the staff as they've gone through and mapped the different ward options that we've had, the 14, the 16 and the 19. And I just really want to place on record that there has been a huge amount of work going into working out those wards. So getting away from the 3 ward options that have been developed is at this late stage in this process, without that full consideration, I think is a little bit concerning if that was to happen. So, finally, I just want to make the point that in Christchurch, in particular, that actually we've seen a huge loss of local democracy, and I think this has been reflected in some of the sentiment that people have put through. We no longer have an elected ECAN, and we won't have one for a few years yet, till 2019. We've had an appointed health board, which is in a mixed model, and we've had a lot of functions that we would normally do as a city taken away from us that are looking set, hopefully through the transition, to come back. So I think it's really important that we are the face of our local community for many decisions and things happening in our city that aren't necessarily things to do with council. But people want someone to talk to, understand and help them explain what's going on. And so yesterday, I was at meetings in Bromley dealing with ECAN issues as much as it was council issues. Or I was in Beachville Road in Redcliffe last night, as well as Heathcote. And these are all communities that councillors represent that are accountable by going and attending meetings, and that was one of the things that came through, that people like to see local councillors, local elected representatives at these places. And so finally, I'll just make the point, the idea of community boards is really important in our city, and we do have a very proud tradition of supporting delegations to our community boards. But history has shown us that that simply isn't enough. And so what we saw when we went from 24 to 12 was, if you cut the number of councillors and expect community boards to pick up the work, that necessarily isn't guaranteed in legislation, and effectively what can happen is the boards get starved of resources, they have cuts to the capacity of being able to be proactive in their local communities. And even us as a council who have said we wish to give more to community boards, some of the community board agendas that we have got virtually nothing on them. So it's not always as easy as simply saying we just want the community boards to pick up the slack as the role of council. It's very much the elected council that determines how strong or how weak a community board can be. And that, is something, until legislation is changed, we simply cannot, I don't believe, take into account. Although we have endorsed the idea of having community boards in our city through this process, and we welcome to get further feedback from them on that. So thank you, Mayor, for letting me introduce that report. Thank you to the staff again for the huge work that's gone on. We've had university students from Canterbury, and I mean, it's a shame in some ways staff can't really talk through that a little bit more, but I know you've heard that presentation previously, so, but there have been external people that have come in, young students, for example, that went around and interviewed communities, and we really thank those people for the work that they've done.
Thank you very much.
So, would you like me to move the option 2? Well, I'd like to move the option 2, 16 ward model. Yep. And just conclude by saying thank you for allowing 19 to be added as a supplementary. I just thought it was part of the consideration that the public could see in terms of that early engagement. So I think it's good to have it formally recognised. Yeah,
thank you. So you've moved option 2 and seconded by Tim Scandrett. Jamie, would you like to put your amendment on the table? Sure. I propose to deal with the overall debate, but I know that some councillors have some questions around the amendment. So I'd like to invite you to move the amendment. It has a seconder. No, it has a seconder already. And then I might just pause there and allow for questions to be asked of staff on the amendment. Okay?
That's fine. So this amendment is obviously an overarching one, which, irrespective of what number of wards are being proposed, it's the same principle. Do you want that's up there? Would you prefer that staff answer any questions on it, and I can speak to it once there was any clarity?
Yeah, I think that would be
preferable.
preferable.
So I'll hold fire, and you can just proceed.
Okay, like. It's on the table. So, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Now, the amendment clearly, as Yanni already alluded, changes the parameters of what this looks like from the models that have been put out. And what I wanted to do was to test the amendment against, if we look at page 237, to test the amendment against 6.10, the options summary. I mean, given that this changes some of the fundamentals in terms of what's been put forward by the Working Party and what's been in front of us for a number of days as well, I was keen to see what effect the amendment, if indeed it's carried, would have on the advice that you've given on each option. So, we've got these bullet points. I don't know whether you're able to go through those one at a time and let us know what effect the amendment would have on the advice that we've been given around the 14 and 16 model, so that we can see, whether it actually does meet the requirements, whether it addresses the public feedback, and whether it aligns with the Working Party view and the other considerations we've got in that paragraph 6.10 on page 237. So that's the first of two questions, and then I've got one question about the 14 and 16 as well.
It's difficult off the top of my head to say this, but I'll walk through this and I think it was covered by Councillor Johansson. Combining into double or triple member wards isn't consistent with the feedback that we heard in the pre-consultation, and isn't consistent with the workshop of councillors, where at that point the majority of you went for single-member wards, which is why we developed the model. So you will see from the summary of the advantages and disadvantages, the majority of the feedback supported a lower population ratio and also wanted effective representation of communities of interest. And one of the aspects that came up in the consultation and was also reflected in the work that was done by Dr. Jean Drage was actually you are better to have representation closer to communities, because otherwise when you start pulling communities together, some communities miss out. And that tends to be lower socioeconomic communities don't get representation, that people areas that have more resources to campaign tend to get elected members standing in those areas. And also you would see in areas such as Whenua Māori, which I think the board raised there or discussed there, both councillors coming from Whenua, in Spraden Heathcote, both councillors coming from Kashmir. So this was some of the feedback we received as we went round. So in terms of being consistent with the feedback, it's probably not as consistent with the feedback as a single member ward. So that's purely based on the feedback we received.
Thank you. And then just one further question relating to the comparison between the 14 and 16 model. And I put this question in the context of Banks Peninsula. And as the Mayor noted in her opening comments, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with are as a result of this extension of the Banks Peninsula ward further into the urban areas. So just thinking of effective representation and in particular communities of interest, in the 16 model, I can see how, you know, we can say that there is a community of interest possibly around landform and coastal interface coming through Sumner and so far around the end of the natural landform of the peninsula. But the 14 model, of course, comes right the way across the top of the Port Hills into Kennedy's Bush and Westmoreland and those areas. And I was just interested in the comments, any comments that you might be able to make that justify how we can think of Kennedy's Bush, Westmoreland, how the upper part of Kashmir could possibly be seen to have a stronger community of interest with Akaroa or with Sumner or with Littleton than it does with Lower Kashmir. Just the boundaries and how we deal with those in the 14 model around the communities of interest question.
Well, from the consultation with the public, the only thing I can really think of that could identify a common community of interest between those areas, that we see the hills and Banks Peninsula as a very, very valuable environmental special area of our city, and secondly, a special recreation area for our whole city. Now, that's not really taking into consideration the residential parts of that area, but certainly the environment and the recreation aspects could pull all those together. And certainly there has been some talk about creating a one sort of park approach to the hills, and maybe that could happen around like a national park approach around the whole of Banks Peninsula and the hill aspects of our city. So that's the only discussion I thought there was. But overall, I think there's probably less community of interest from what residents said on the 14 model for that ward than there is on the 16 model. We did have the residents' associations from the Sumner area saying they felt they did have a community of interest with the harbour areas and with Littleton.
But we didn't have
we didn't have that with people in Westmore. Their community of interest was into the city in that way.
So it would be fair to say that on the 14 model, the boundaries are more arbitrary rather than driven by what we heard in the community engagement.
The boundaries are more driven by us being restricted by the mesh blocks and the numbers. That's correct. But maybe Mary's got something
Actually,
to add to that.
can you just put in there the mysteries of mesh blocks, because people don't know that, and this is a really good, because it's live streamed, and we'll be able to do a link to it. I really want people to understand that it isn't like looking at maps and saying, well, there's an obvious line. So welcome, people of Christchurch, to the world of mesh blocks.
So I would report on the 14th of May, and the report on the 14th of May had a long appendix which described what the legislation required of us. So the legislation requires that boundaries must follow mesh blocks. And so we can't, it's very difficult if we want to make a boundary outside a mesh block.
But what are they, and what are they designed for?
Right. So they are there's mesh blocks that build up into census area units, and so they are really for the census.
Yes.
So they are about numbers of people in mesh blocks and areas. So they are not where you would put a natural boundary in a representation review often. So that's why we have these strange squiggly lines on some of those boundaries, because we have to follow the mesh block boundary.
So it's for the purpose of collating statistics, which are then used for a variety of purposes. So mesh blocks are used for decile ratings in schools, and they just happen to be used as a requirement for boundaries.
Yes, that's a much better description than I gave.
No,
that's absolutely right.
Just
Perfect.
sharing.
Perfect. Yes.
About the plus or minus 10% as well, I think. Can you
Yeah,
explain
could you
that?
talk about that?
So that's another legislative requirement around fair representation. The definition of fair representation in the Act is that wards must be within the plus or minus the average ward numbers of what was that, sorry? Apart from an exception, and you have to make for a special exception for an isolated community.
And we did that for Banks Peninsula last time, and the representation review said no more. I mean, not the representation review, the result of the representation review was the Local Government Commission said not anymore.
Yes.
Banks
So-
Peninsula has to come into the city.
Yeah. So when you combine those two things of having to follow mesh blocks and having to have every ward within the plus or minus of the average, it is a very difficult exercise to map these wards. And any small change you make somewhere has implications on every other boundary and ward you're making, as you have to get the numbers right and balance them across everything. So
But in terms of the process that we're in now, we consider a model that then goes out for, well, it'll come back to us in a form which we are then able to vote on and put out for public consultation.
That's right.
And at that point, we then set ourselves up as a hearings panel,
right.
and we hear submissions and weigh up all of these things. But it's like the long-term plan.
Yep.
Once it goes out for public consultation, we must have an open mind. We must be able to hear people's submissions in a very open way, and an element of predetermination would be a problem for us. And as I understand it, every single council member that wants to be part of the decision has to be part of all of the hearings. So it's not something that you can dip in and out of. It's something that you're either here for the lot of, or you're not able to contribute to the decision. And that's tragically true even if you get sick on the last day of hearings.
What do Ian said? Ian, are you able to give legal advice about that? That councillors have to be here for the entire hearings? Because I think that you had some additional views on that, didn't you?
But I think we're following it up.